A night ripped wide by thunder. At the iron gates of Harcourt Manor, a shattered carriage exhales its secret. Arabella Dwyer, a penniless governess cast into the storm. The door opens to a man the world has not touched in 11 years, the Duke of Rathbourne, and the house itself seems to hold its breath. Duty demands distance. Desire whispers, come closer. Portraits watch, candles hiss. One choice will either bind two broken souls or break them beyond repair. What sin waits in the shadows? Which truth refuses to stay buried? Before we begin, tell us where you're listening from and share. What do you crave most in a period romance? London, December of the year 1856. The night had broken open like a wound. Rain fell, not in gentle sheets, but in furious torrents, drumming against the cobbled road that wound its way toward the great estate of Harcourt Manor. Wind howled through the bare trees like a widow keening her loss, and the lantern hanging at the rear of the battered carriage swung wildly, casting ghost-like shadows that danced upon the skeletal hedgerows. Inside the shuddering carriage sat a young woman clutching her shawl with trembling fingers. Arabella Dwyer was soaked through, her bonnet ruined, her gloves stiff with cold. Each jolt of the wheels through the mud-strewn path echoed in her bones. She had not spoken for hours. There had been no one to speak to. The coachman, surly and silent, had not said a word since the moment he left her employer's townhouse with instructions to leave her far from polite society. She had not known it would come to this. She had endured the whispered remarks, the too long glances, the hand that brushed too close on the stair. She had endured them all in silence, until she no longer could. And now, the punishment for her resistance was banishment. She who had no dowry, no family, no place in the world beyond a ledger and a lesson book, was discarded like something inconvenient. Then, with a sudden lurch and a splintering crack, the carriage veered violently to the side. The horse reared. Wood splintered. Arabella's body was thrown against the panel, pain flaring in her shoulder as darkness rushed in. When she opened her eyes, she was lying in the mud. Her cloak was tangled around her legs. Rain struck her face without mercy. The coachman was gone, fled without word or warning. The lantern had shattered, and before her, rising out of the mist like something summoned from a fever dream, stood an iron gate. Beyond it, barely visible through the trees, a great manor loomed, its windows dark but for one distant light. With every breath ragged in her throat, Arabella pulled herself upright. The pain in her side screamed, but she did not cry out. She pressed a hand to the gate. It creaked open beneath her fingers, the sound swallowed by wind. She stepped into the domain of the dead, or so it felt. Harcourt Manor was known throughout London's upper circles as a place of mourning. The Duke of Rathbourne, once one of society's most dazzling men, had not been seen in over a decade. His wife's death had closed his doors and sealed his heart. The house, they said, had followed suit. No galas, no visitors, no joy, only silence. And now Arabella stood on its threshold, cold, bruised, and utterly alone. She knocked once, twice, nothing. On the third try, just as she thought she might collapse from the cold, the great wooden door creaked open, not from within, but by her own trembling hand. The entry hall was dimly lit by a single oil lamp near the hearth. Shadows clung to the high ceilings. The air smelled faintly of lavender and something older, dust and loss. She stepped inside, dripping onto the polished floor, her breath fogging in the chill. She did not see him at first, but he saw her. From the darkness beyond the stairs, Nathaniel Harcourt, the Duke of Rathbourne, emerged like a figure carved from shadow and memory. Tall, broad-shouldered, and cloaked in a dressing gown of deep navy trimmed in silver, he carried himself with the weary elegance of a man who had long ceased to care what the world thought of him. His hair, dark with threads of silver at the temples, was damp from the storm. He had been out, perhaps pacing the grounds, chasing ghosts only he could see. Their eyes met. Arabella froze. His gaze, grey-blue and unreadable, swept over her in one slow, assessing moment, not with impropriety, but with the stunned scrutiny of a man confronted with something living. She straightened, though her knees nearly buckled. I apologize, Your Grace," she whispered. "My carriage. There was an accident. I had nowhere else." He said nothing for a moment. The silence stretched between them like a drawn curtain. Then, "You are injured." A statement, not a question. I believe my shoulder is bruised. You should not be on your feet." Still, she stood. He stepped closer. The lamplight caught the planes of his face, aristocratic, shadowed, with grief etched deep around his eyes. She caught the faint scent of sandalwood and smoke. Her breath faltered. "I will call Mrs. Ellison," he said at last, voice low and measured. "She will find you a room and a fire." "You are allowing me to stay?" "For tonight," he replied, almost reluctantly. "This house is large, Miss Dwyer," she answered. "Arabella Dwyer." He inclined his head. "Miss Dwyer, welcome then to Harcourt Manor." There was no welcome in his voice, only obligation. Yet in his eyes, something flickered. Recognition, perhaps, not of her, but of the strangeness of the moment. Of a story beginning where none was expected. She curtsied, winced at the pain in her side, and said nothing more. As she followed the housekeeper up the stairs moments later, Arabella did not glance back, but had she done so, she would have seen the Duke still standing in the shadows, his hand curled tightly around the banister, and his gaze fixed not on her retreating figure, but on the space where she had first appeared, like a ghost of something the house had long forgotten, a future. And outside, the storm raged on. The first light of dawn in Harcourt Manor did not so much arrive as bleed slowly through the high windows, grey and hesitant, as though reluctant to disturb the silence that ruled those ancestral walls. The storm had passed, but its memory clung to the house like damp lace, whispers in the drapery, shadows in the corners, a chill in the stones that no fire could quite dispel. Arabella Dwyer awoke not in a room, but in a world unlike any she had known. The bed beneath her was carved from dark walnut, the posts draped with heavy velvet curtains in a deep, faded green. A canopy of embroidery floated above her head, worn but regal, like a duchess in mourning. The sheets were soft, though faintly perfumed with lavender and thyme. She sat up slowly, her body protesting with dull aches from the night before, her shoulder a throb of remembrance. For a long moment, she simply listened. There was no clatter of dishes, no servants' footsteps, no calling bells, only the tick of an unseen clock and the occasional creak of wood expanding with the cold. The silence was not peaceful, it was watchful. A gentle knock came at the door. Before Arabella could answer, it opened with the slow grace of habit, and Mrs. Margaret Ellison entered. The housekeeper was a woman of about 55, her figure sturdy, her face round and stern, softened only slightly by a pair of keen, intelligent eyes. Her grey hair was pulled tightly into a bun beneath a lace-trimmed cap, and her black wool gown, apron, and the set of keys hanging from her waist made it clear she was not a woman to be trifled with. "You're awake," she said without greeting, her tone efficient. "His Grace said you were injured." Arabella nodded, clutching the blanket closer to her chest. "My shoulder, yes, but nothing broken, I believe." Mrs. Ellison moved closer, scrutinizing her. "You're pale. Have you eaten?" "No, ma'am, not since yesterday." She turned toward the hearth, where a small fire had been lit, and adjusted the logs with a practiced hand. "I've brought porridge. It isn't hot, but it's warm enough. You'll dress after that. There are garments set aside in the wardrobe, Miss Alcott's old things. You and she were near a size." Arabella's fingers clutched the blanket tighter. "Miss Alcott, my niece, former companion to the late Duchess. She married last spring and left the house in good standing." There was a pause after the word "left," as if it carried a different weight in Harcourt Manor. Arabella nodded, murmuring, "Thank you." Mrs. Ellison looked at her again, this time not as if examining a stranger, but as if trying to fit her into the fabric of the house. Her eyes softened, just enough to be noticed. "You needn't fear, Miss Dwyer. You're not the first lost soul to pass through these halls." With that, she departed, her steps silent on the thick carpets. Arabella rose slowly. She found the wardrobe, opened it, and touched the sleeves of the garments within, woolen gowns in muted tones, high-collared and well-worn but neatly kept. She selected a dove-grey dress with a small embroidered cuff, the closest to modest elegance she could find, and dressed in silence, the mirror reflecting a woman who did not yet feel like herself. When she finally stepped out into the corridor, the cold met her like an old friend. The hall was long and narrow, panelled in dark wood, lit only by narrow windows that cast pale shadows on the walls. Portraits lined one side, ancestors likely. Men in powdered wigs, women in silks with unreadable expressions. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her as she walked. She did not know where she was going. The manor was not merely large, it was labyrinthine. At each turn, a staircase or passage offered a choice, but none of them felt like invitation. The air carried the scent of old roses and waxed floors, with something fainter beneath it, something like stillness aged into stone. Eventually, she found herself in the library. The door had been left slightly ajar, as if forgotten by someone in haste. It was a magnificent room, domed and wood-panelled, its tall windows half-curtained in brocade. A great hearth stood unlit, and the shelves stretched to the ceiling, filled with tomes that bore the weight of centuries. She approached one shelf and ran her finger along the spines, volumes on Latin, theology, poetry. One book, Reflections on Solitude, had its leather cracked from use. She smiled faintly, then she felt it, the weight of his gaze. She turned slowly. At the far end of the room, partially hidden behind one of the tall wingback chairs, stood Nathaniel Harcourt, Duke of Rathbourne. He was dressed now in a frock coat of black wool, perfectly tailored, with a dark cravat pinned by a single sapphire. His hair was still damp at the temples, though combed, and his expression, composed, distant, belied the intensity of his eyes. Arabella lowered her gaze. "Forgive me. I didn't mean to intrude." "You are not intruding," he said, his voice quiet but resonant. "The house belongs to no one these days. It has long since forgotten how to receive guests." She looked up, startled by the melancholy in his tone. "It remembers," she said gently, "in the firelight, in the care taken with each room, in the silence." His eyes flickered. For a moment he looked as though he might speak, but the words never came. Instead he nodded once and stepped further into the light. "Mrs. Ellison told me your name." "Miss Dwyer." "Yes, Your Grace." He glanced at the shelves. "Do you read poetry?" "I do." "Then you may remain here." It was not an invitation, nor was it dismissal. It was a statement of fact, like weather. Arabella bowed her head slightly. "Thank you, Your Grace." Nathaniel moved past her toward a cabinet and poured himself a glass of brandy, though the hour was barely past breakfast. His hand was steady, but she noticed how he avoided the mirror on the far wall, as though he did not wish to see himself. "I trust you are recovering." "I am. The warmth has helped." He nodded again. Silence stretched between them, thick but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that held space for something else. Then, without turning, he said, "You will find this house has its rules, Miss Dwyer. Most are unspoken. They concern rooms that remain locked, music that remains unplayed, and memories that remain undisturbed." Arabella's heart beat faster. Not with fear, but with a strange, aching awareness. "I understand." And she did. For all the grandeur, the manor was a tomb wrapped in brocade, a monument to a life half-lived. And he, this man who stood with such authority, yet such sorrow, was its keeper. As she slipped out of the library minutes later, she did not look back. But she felt his presence linger in the room like perfume on the air. And as the door closed gently behind her, she knew one thing. She had stepped into a house that felt like a heart learning, slowly, painfully, how to beat again. The days that followed drifted like mist through the stone corridors of Harcourt Manor, softening the harsh lines of grief that clung to its walls. Outside, the winter sun was little more than a pale disk veiled in grey. Inside, time slowed, thick and suspended, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Arabella Dwyer moved through that hush like a ghost who had forgotten she was no longer dead. Her injuries had begun to fade. The bruises upon her shoulder softened into shades of yellow and violet, and the stiffness in her limbs eased with each reluctant morning. But it was not only her body that healed. The house, strange and austere though it was, offered a kind of reluctant sanctuary. Not warm, not welcoming, but still it did not turn her away. She walked its hallways by daylight, when the oil lamps remained unlit and the silence was deep but not unkind. Her shoes tapped softly on the stone, her hands sometimes trailing along the panels of oak that seemed older than memory. Occasionally she passed a servant, most of them older, all of them polite without being familiar. No one asked questions, no one offered more than was necessary. Yet it was in these quiet observations that Arabella began to understand the rules of the house, not those spoken aloud, but those etched into its very bones. Certain doors remained locked, certain wings remained untouched. The grand pianoforte in the drawing room was never played. The dining room, with its ornate chandelier and pale blue walls, remained in eternal dusk behind its closed doors. It was a house of withheld things. One morning, as frost glittered outside the narrow windows and the scent of coal lingered in the hall, Arabella found herself standing before a tall, arched door at the far end of the east wing. She had not seen it before, not because it had been hidden, but because something about it asked not to be seen. Her hand hovered near the handle. "You won't want to go in there, miss." The voice came from behind, low and gravelly. She turned and found Mr. Collins, the butler, watching her. He was a tall man, with a back still rigid despite his years, and eyes that had seen more than they revealed. "I wasn't," she began. He raised a hand gently. "I know. It's just an old room, been closed near on 11 years. "Whose room was it?" she asked, though she already knew. His silence was answer enough, and when he finally turned and walked away, she remained still, her palm inches from the door that held back an ocean of sorrow. Later that day, she sat in the smaller of the two parlours, one of the few rooms the staff kept clean and aired, and stitched by the light of the window. The thread moved in and out of the fabric with a rhythm that calmed her, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Nathaniel Harcourt had not spoken to her again since their meeting in the library, and yet she felt him everywhere, a presence that moved like wind, unseen, but undeniably there. She glimpsed him once, walking across the upper gallery in the early evening, his silhouette framed by candlelight. Another time, she heard his voice drifting from the study, low, deliberate, speaking with someone in tones too distant to decipher. And once, while she was reading in the conservatory, she had looked up to find him watching her through the glass. Their eyes had met for only a moment before he turned and vanished into the corridor. But the echo of that look lingered. He was not indifferent, he was wary, and that wariness unsettled her more than cruelty ever could. That evening, as the lamps were being lit and the long shadows of dusk stretched like fingers through the halls, Mrs. Ellison brought Arabella a cup of tea and lingered longer than usual. There was something in her expression, an unease she tried to hide behind her brisk manner. "You've made quite the impression, Miss Dwyer," she said, placing the porcelain cup gently on the side table. Arabella looked up from her embroidery. "Have I?" The housekeeper folded her hands, resting them against her apron. "You carry yourself with grace. You don't ask for more than you're given. But you're curious." Arabella felt the warmth rise to her cheeks. "Forgive me. I don't mean to trespass where I'm not welcome." Mrs. Ellison sat across from her, which she had never done before. "Sometimes silence is its own kind of trespass, child." This house has had too much of it." Arabella placed her needle aside. "You speak as though it were alive." "It is," the older woman replied, "alive, but grieving." Arabella studied her face. "Because of the Duchess?" A shadow passed through Mrs. Ellison's gaze. Her grace was gentle. She brought light into the Duke's life, into this house. When she died, she stopped herself, then continued, voice quiet. "Some say he died with her, at least the part that knew how to feel joy." Arabella hesitated. How did she die? For a long moment, the only sound was the fire crackling in the hearth. "Childbirth," came the answer at last. "On a morning not unlike this one, snow on the ground. The baby was lost as well." Arabella's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." "So are we all," Mrs. Ellison murmured. Then she stood, smoothed her apron, and said no more. That night in London, the conversation was not so solemn. In the richly appointed drawing room of Lord Edwin Pembroke, laughter rang out beneath the golden chandelier, but behind the laughter was venom. "A governess, they say?" Pembroke told the assembled gentlemen, swirling his brandy with a practiced wrist. "Young, plain, and conveniently in need of shelter." The others chuckled. One of them raised a brow. "Surely not at Harcourt Manor." "The very same," Pembroke said with a smirk. "It seems grief has given way to appetite, or loneliness, or madness," someone muttered. Pembroke leaned back in his chair, satisfied. "Either way, it will not remain a secret for long. The Duke of Rathbourne may prefer shadows, but London thrives on scandal. And what better scandal than the resurrection of a man said to be buried in mourning by the hands of a governess no one had ever heard of until now?" Back at Harcourt Manor, the fire in Arabella's chamber burned low. She sat at her writing desk, a candle casting flickering light across the page. She had begun to write a letter to no one, just words, to keep her heart steady. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. She did not know what rumors stirred in distant drawing rooms or what ghosts lingered behind closed doors. But she knew this. She had entered a house of silence, and now, without ever raising her voice, she was stirring echoes. The morning unfolded with a softness rare in English winters. A gauzy light filtered through the pale clouds above Harcourt Manor, illuminating frost-laced hedgerows and the skeletal silhouettes of bare oaks. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of damp leaves and cold stone, and the silence of the estate carried a hush that felt almost sacred. Arabella Dwyer stepped outside, wrapped in a borrowed wool cloak, the color of ash and trimmed with worn fur. Her gloves were mended but warm, and her boots crunched lightly over the gravel paths as she wandered deeper into the gardens that slumbered beneath winter's breath. She had not meant to stray far, but the landscape seemed to draw her. Past the yew arch and the sundial half covered in moss, beyond the dried rose beds and the overgrown topiary that had long since surrendered to time, she discovered a narrow path, almost hidden by brambles. The air changed there, quieter, older, as if the earth remembered things men had tried to forget. At the end of that path stood a greenhouse, veiled in ivy and leaning slightly with age. Its once grand ironwork was dulled with rust, the glass panels dulled by dust and time. Vines curled around the framework like slender fingers clinging to memory. Arabella pushed open the door with effort. Hinges groaned in protest, and a burst of cold, stale air greeted her. Inside, the space was dim, but not lifeless. Light struggled through the dirty panes, falling in fractured beams upon marble tiles cracked by roots. A wrought-iron bench sat beneath a skeletal fig tree, and brittle flower pots lined the walls, filled with dry soil and the faded remnants of once vibrant things. She walked slowly between the stone planters, brushing her fingers against the edges of forgotten ferns. There were hints of the room it had once been, a place of life, of warmth, of growing things, but now it felt like a chapel to memory. In the center stood a large planter of carved limestone, half covered by a tangle of ivy. Arabella reached out and gently pulled back the overgrowth. Beneath it, barely visible, was a plaque. The letters were faded, but she could still read them. For Clara, who made everything bloom. She stepped back, breath caught in her throat. And then she heard it, the shift of footsteps behind her. She turned. Nathaniel Harcourt, Duke of Rathbourne, stood in the doorway, framed by the faded light like a figure summoned by thought alone. He had not shaved that morning. The faintest shadow lined his jaw. His dark overcoat bore the damp of the garden's breath, and his gloves were in his hand, as if he had only meant to walk and found himself drawn here by accident or fate. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, neither spoke. "It was hers," he said at last, voice low and almost hollow. "The greenhouse." Arabella nodded slowly. "I thought it might be." He stepped inside, each movement deliberate, as though crossing sacred ground. His eyes moved around the space, but it was clear he no longer saw what was there, only what had been. "She loved the winter blooms best," he murmured, said they were proof that beauty did not obey seasons, that even in the cold, life insists on living. Arabella swallowed gently, her voice quiet. "She sounds kind." "She was," he said, and the words seemed to cost him something. "But more than that, she was brave, gentle, yes, but not weak. She saw things others missed. She saw me." His gaze drifted toward the limestone planter, and something shifted in his expression. Not pain, but something quieter. Arabella took a breath, hesitating. "You don't speak of her often." "No." "Why now?" He looked at her then, truly looked, and the air between them changed. "Because you asked," he said simply. Emotion stirred in her chest, quiet and sudden. It wasn't affection yet. It wasn't longing, but it was the first thread of connection, fragile and trembling. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said softly. "You didn't." He paused. "No one comes here? Not even the staff?" Arabella looked around the abandoned room. "That's a shame. There's still life here, hidden but waiting." He tilted his head slightly, considering her. "Do you always speak as though the world listens?" She smiled faintly. "Only when I think it might." He turned from her then, but the spell was not broken. He walked to the planter and ran his fingers along the edge, brushing the plaque with the back of his hand. "I used to sit here with her," he murmured. "She would prune the vines, talk about planting things in spring. I listened, but I never really understood what it meant to care for something so tender. I didn't know how." Arabella said nothing. The moment required silence, not words. Finally, he looked up at her again. "I should go." She inclined her head. "Of course, Your Grace." But he didn't move right away. He stood there, looking at her as if he wished to say something more, something he had not spoken aloud in 11 years. In the end, he only said, "You may come here if you wish. The greenhouse." "Thank you," she whispered. Then he left, and the door swung shut behind him with a soft click. That night, Arabella sat in her chamber by the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea long gone cold. Her thoughts were not on the day, but on the man whose eyes had held so much silence. When Mrs. Ellison entered to collect the tray, Arabella spoke without looking up. "May I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you not send me away when I arrived?" The housekeeper paused, considering. "Because he didn't, and I follow his orders even when I don't understand them." Arabella turned toward her. "And now?" Mrs. Ellison looked at her closely. "Now, I understand a bit more." Arabella's hands tightened around the cup. "There was a man in my previous post." The housekeeper said nothing, but her eyes sharpened. "The son of the household. He believed I owed him something for my position. I refused him. Twice. The third time, I struck him." Mrs. Ellison's expression did not shift. "And they let you go. They called it a matter of moral discretion. I had no reference." The older woman gave a slow nod. "You've nothing to be ashamed of, Miss Dwyer." Arabella exhaled, the tension slipping from her shoulders. "Still, I needed someone to believe me. No one did." "You're here now," Mrs. Ellison said simply, "and I believe you." Arabella looked into the flames, a quiet strength settling in her chest. Outside, snow had begun to fall, and in his bedchamber, Nathaniel Harcourt stood at the window, watching the flakes drift through the night. He had tried to sleep, but dreams had come. Dreams of Clara, smiling with her hands deep in the soil of the greenhouse, humming some forgotten tune. But when he woke, it was not Clara's face that lingered behind his eyes. It was Arabella's. A sharp wind swept through the grounds of Harcourt Manor, bending the bare branches of the trees and rattling the windows with a force that felt almost deliberate, as though nature herself sought to disturb the stillness within. The house, once resigned to silence, now held a tension beneath its floors and between its walls, an unease not born of storms or seasons, but of hearts shifting in ways neither of them dared name. In the study, tucked between shelves of legal ledgers and correspondence untouched for months, Nathaniel Harcourt stood before the hearth with a letter in hand. The seal was already broken, the contents read and reread until the words etched themselves into his memory. "Your Grace," I write with concern, "rumors of a young woman residing at Harcourt Manor have begun to circulate. While I understand your private affairs are your own, the fragility of reputation cannot be overstated. A charitable arrangement may be the most discreet solution. Respectfully, Samuel Bertram, Solicitor Nathaniel, crushed the letter in his fist, jaw tight. He could hear the faint ticking of the clock behind him, a soft reminder that time was moving. Slowly, but relentlessly. He had allowed her to remain longer than was reasonable. The staff had noticed. London had noticed. And now, the vultures circled. He turned to the fire, watching as it cast golden light across the room, illuminating the crystal decanter on the sideboard, the high-backed chair where Clara once read. Her absence still lived there, but so did something else now. A presence, quiet but undeniable. Arabella. He spoke her name only in thought, never aloud, as if doing so would make her real in ways he could not afford. Still, he could not ignore the truth. She had softened the edges of the silence. She had spoken gently where others demanded. She had seen the house for what it was, and, God help him, she had seen him. Not the Duke, not the widower, the man. And for that, she had to go. That afternoon, Mrs. Ellison found Arabella in the sewing room, folding linens with meticulous care. The housekeeper hesitated in the doorway, her usual briskness dulled by something almost reluctant. "His Grace has made arrangements," she said without ceremony. Arabella looked up, her hands pausing. "Arrangements? A charitable patroness in Bath, a Lady Withersby. She's in need of a companion for her convalescence. It would be a respectable post." Arabella blinked once. "I see." He thought it best to present it as a new opportunity. "For whom?" Mrs. Ellison's mouth tightened. "I'm only the messenger, Miss Dwyer." Arabella nodded, folding the last piece of linen slowly. "Precisely. When am I expected to leave?" 3 days. Arabella stood, her back straight despite the storm gathering behind her ribs. "Thank you, Mrs. Ellison." Once alone, she walked to her chamber, each step heavier than the last. She sat upon the edge of the bed and stared at the window. The frost had gathered on the panes again, delicate and intricate, like a warning whispered in lace. He had not spoken to her directly. He had not come to explain, not even a word of farewell. After all the moments they had shared, brief but true, he chose silence again. And so she began to pack. That evening, as candlelight flickered against the brocade walls and the fire in the drawing room cast dancing shadows upon the rug, Arabella descended the staircase for what she believed would be the last time. She found him in the library, as she had once before. He was standing at the window, a glass of brandy untouched in his hand. He did not turn when she entered. "I'm told I'll be leaving in 3 days," she said calmly, her voice steady despite the heat in her chest. He closed his eyes briefly. "It's for the best." "For whom?" "For both of us," he replied, turning at last. His face was impassive, but his eyes, those storm-grey eyes, held something else: strain, conflict, pain. "You should have told me yourself," she said. I am telling you now." She stepped closer. "No. You're delivering a verdict, like a magistrate passing sentence. You made the decision before speaking to me, before looking me in the eye. You have no idea the danger you're in by remaining here," he snapped, his voice sharper than she had ever heard it. "This house, this name, my name, it carries weight. It carries expectation, and you—" He stopped, breathing hard. Arabella's chin lifted. "And I what? Am not fit to carry it, to stand beneath this roof, to walk these halls as anything more than a shadow?" "You are trespassing on sacred ground," he said tightly. The words struck her like a slap. She staggered back a step, her breath catching in her throat. "Is that how you see me? A trespasser?" she whispered. Nathaniel turned away, running a hand through his hair, frustration etched into every line of his posture. "I see a woman who deserves a life not tainted by my grief, by my ghosts." "Then perhaps it is not your ghosts I've disturbed," she said quietly. "Perhaps it is your heart." He froze. Arabella stepped closer once more, trembling. "I have never asked for anything from you. Not shelter, not kindness, not even honesty. But now I ask for one thing, truth. Did you send me away because of what they're saying in London? Or because you fear what it means to feel again?" His jaw clenched. He did not answer. That silence, his oldest weapon, fell between them once more. But this time it did not protect him. It condemned him. Arabella's voice broke. I thought perhaps, in your silence, you were still trying to live. That your grief was a wound, not a wall." He turned to her then, sharply. "You know nothing of my grief, because you won't let anyone near it." His eyes flashed. "Because no one belongs there but her." The air emptied between them. Arabella's chest rose and fell rapidly. She blinked against the sting in her eyes, but did not let the tears fall. "I see," she said softly. "Then I will leave you to it." She turned and walked toward the door. Nathaniel did not stop her. As the door clicked shut behind her, he closed his eyes and leaned heavily against the mantel, the firelight flickering across his face like judgment. His glass remained full. In her chamber, Arabella stood by the open trunk, her hands still for a long while. Then, slowly, she closed the lid. Not because she would not leave, but because she knew now that even when she did, a part of her would remain behind. The part he had touched without ever laying a hand upon her. Winter had cast its pale veil over London, covering rooftops in powdered frost and turning gaslit streets into ribbons of silver and smoke. Inside the grand homes of Mayfair, invitations passed from hand to hand like whispered secrets, each one gilded in anticipation and veiled contempt. The city was hungry, not for peace, nor for charity, but for scandal, and Lord Edwin Pembroke, ever attuned to the scent of blood in the water, was all too eager to feed it. His annual winter masquerade was, as expected, a spectacle of opulence and precision. The ballroom at Pembroke House had been transformed into a living theatre, draped in crimson velvet and lit by the crystalline blaze of 3 chandeliers. Musicians tuned their instruments beneath balconies dusted with artificial snow, while footmen in powdered wigs offered champagne on silver trays. Masks glinted, gold, pearl and jet, hiding eyes but not intentions. Whispers flew faster than fans. "They say she's coming. Unescorted? No, sponsored. The Dowager Duchess of Wycliffe of all people. Scandalous, delicious. She's a governess. She's a parasite. She's brave." The subject of their muttered awe, Arabella Dwyer, stood at the top of the staircase, a vision entirely out of place, yet inexplicably luminous. She wore no jewels, no feathers, no dazzling silk imported from Paris. Her gown was simple, dove-grey muslin with a modest neckline and delicate pearl embroidery along the sleeves. Her hair was swept back in an elegant chignon, and a thin velvet ribbon circled her throat. Her mask, a soft creation of grey lace and satin, concealed little but declared everything. She descended with the composure of a woman who had walked through fire and had chosen not to burn. Beside her, the Dowager Duchess of Wycliffe, regal in navy taffeta and diamonds, offered a subtle nod to those who dared to look too long. Her sponsorship had turned heads. Her presence had silenced rooms. They stepped into the ballroom together. Conversations hushed like candles suddenly snuffed. Arabella did not flinch. The room spun around her, colors, perfumes, music and masks, but she remained grounded. She was not there to beg, not to belong. She was there because they needed to see her. Lord Pembroke was the first to greet her, as planned. He appeared in a coat of plum velvet, a peacock feather cresting his golden mask. His smile was all show, his words dipped in cordial venom. "Miss Dwyer," he said with mock reverence, bowing low. "How fortunate we are to be graced by your presence. I had not realized the art of instruction in embroidery and piano scales could inspire such elegance." Arabella met his gaze without blinking. "The world is full of surprises, my lord." He chuckled. "And tell me, does the Duke of Rathbourne know of your appearance this evening?" She tilted her head. "As much as he needs to." Pembroke's eyes gleamed behind his mask. "We do so adore a mystery. Do enjoy yourself, while you may." He moved on, swept into a circle of sycophants, and the music resumed. Arabella stood alone for a moment, her pulse steady, her breath slow. She had rehearsed this night in her mind for hours, how to smile just enough, how to walk without hesitation, how to remain untouched by their words. And yet, beneath it all, there was an ache, one that could not be masked, and then the air changed. The orchestra faltered, just slightly. Voices dipped, eyes turned first in curiosity, then in disbelief. He had come. Nathaniel Harcourt, Duke of Rathbourne, entered without announcement, without fanfare. He wore a black tailcoat with subtle satin trim, his waistcoat a shade of charcoal, his cravat secured with a familiar sapphire pin. His mask was simple, matte black and unadorned, revealing the jaw, the mouth, the storm-grey eyes that did not scan the room. They searched only for her. He moved like a shadow given form, parting the crowd not by force, but by presence. And when he reached Arabella, he did not bow. He did not greet her with society's careful words. He simply extended his hand. "Dance with me." Her breath caught. So did the room's. She placed her gloved hand in his, and together they stepped onto the floor. The waltz began, slow, deliberate, every note ringing with disbelief. They danced beneath the chandeliers, the light catching the silver thread of her gown, the darkness of his coat. He held her not too tightly, but not distantly either. His palm rested at the small of her back, his fingers warm through her gloves. Her other hand rested in his, fingers trembling just enough to betray her composure. Their eyes never left each other. The room ceased to exist. "Nathaniel," she murmured, voice barely audible over the music. "Why?" "Because I would not let them take your name from you," he answered. "Not tonight. You sent me away. I was wrong. You broke something," she whispered, her throat tightening. "I know." His voice cracked, soft and honest. "And I came to mend it." "Before or after they saw me bleed?" she asked. His eyes darkened. "Before, the moment I imagined this room without you in it. They moved in perfect time, but their words carried no rhythm, only truth. Heavy, breathless, fragile truth. Around them the dance continued, but every head turned, every mask tilted. The Duke of Rathbourne, who had vanished from society for 11 years, who had mourned his wife in silence, now held a governess in his arms, unashamed and unmasked by grief. Lord Pembroke watched from the edge of the floor, his smile stiff, his pride bruised. He moved toward the musicians. With a whisper and a glance, the music changed, faster, sharper, designed to trip the feet of those not bred for spectacle. But Arabella did not stumble. Nathaniel steadied her with the gentlest pressure of his hand, and together they turned, swift and fluid. "I believe this is meant to humiliate us," she said with a wry smile. Then let's give them something beautiful to remember. And they did. They finished the waltz with flawless grace, the final note echoing like a bell through the chamber. Applause did not erupt. It hesitated. And then, with reluctance and awe, it began. One clap, then another. Soon, the room thundered with admiration masked as politeness. Arabella curtsied, Nathaniel bowed. Then, without a word, he offered his arm. And together, they walked off the floor, not hidden, not ashamed, but radiant in their defiance. Outside, snow had begun to fall over London, gentle, persistent, and cleansing. Inside, the world shifted, and nothing would be quite the same again. The journey from London back to Harcourt Manor was cloaked in silence, but it was not the silence of anger or awkwardness. It was a silence full of unsaid things, of questions unformed and emotions too fragile to voice in the gentle jostle of the carriage. Outside, snow fell in hushed spirals over the countryside, blanketing fields and hedgerows with a softness that made the world feel suspended in time. Arabella Dwyer sat opposite Nathaniel Harcourt, her hands folded in her lap, her gloves tucked between her fingers as if to keep them warm. She did not look at him often, but when she did, she noticed how his posture had changed. Still proud, still dignified, but something within him had loosened. He no longer clung to the weight of silence the way he once had. He carried it now, yes, but shared it with her. When the carriage reached the iron gates of the estate, the lamps were already lit. Warm golden orbs flickered through the snow like beacons. Arabella watched as the great house came into view, its tall windows glowing behind frosted panes, its familiar facade wrapped in shadows and memory. And as the carriage rolled to a stop, she felt something tighten inside her chest, not fear, something closer to returning. The doors opened. Nathaniel stepped out first, then extended a hand to her. She placed hers in his without hesitation. The warmth of his palm seeped into her skin, and for a brief moment neither of them moved. "It's only for the night," he said quietly, as if reminding himself. She nodded. "I know." But even that acknowledgement trembled beneath the surface of something unspoken. Inside, the manor welcomed her not with fanfare, but with familiarity. The scent of wax and winter roses, the echo of her own footsteps on the marble, the low hum of firelight behind closed doors. Mrs. Ellison appeared at the base of the stairs, her gaze flicking from Arabella to the Duke and back again. She did not speak, but her approval was written in the softness of her expression. "Prepare Clara's chamber," Nathaniel said, his voice firm but low. Arabella's breath caught. The housekeeper stiffened, but after a beat, she nodded. "Yes, Your Grace." Arabella turned toward him, unsure whether to protest, but he met her gaze steadily. "It's time," he said. "That room has been closed long enough." He led her up the stairs himself. They reached the corridor she had never dared approach. At its end stood a door of polished oak, carved with roses. Nathaniel hesitated only for a heartbeat before opening it and stepping aside. She crossed the threshold into Clara's world. The chamber was untouched by time. Pale blue wallpaper adorned the walls, lined with ivory moldings. A delicate canopy bed sat beneath a high window dressed in gauze. The fireplace still bore a vase with dried lavender, and on the vanity a silver hairbrush rested beside a bottle of rose water. Everything was still. "It's beautiful," Arabella whispered. Nathaniel remained at the door, not entering. "She loved this room," he said. "It was the first one she asked to design. She said it should feel like a sky where one could sleep inside a dream." Arabella stepped farther in. The room was not haunted. It was waiting. "You may sleep here tonight," he said. "No one will disturb you." She turned to face him. "And you? I'll be elsewhere. I only wanted you to know it's no longer a shrine." His voice trembled at the edges. She nodded, unable to speak. He pulled something from his coat pocket, then crossed the room slowly. In his hand was a small velvet box, midnight blue. He opened it. Inside rested the sapphire pin, the one she had seen before, nestled always at the knot of his cravat, cold and gleaming like a star never fallen. "This belonged to my father," he said. "I wore it the day I married Clara. I wore it to bury her too. I have worn it every day since." Arabella's throat ached. "Why give it to me?" "Because grief should not own it anymore," he answered. "Because it is time for it to mean something else." He placed it in her hand. The sapphire was heavy, cold, beautiful. "Thank you," she said, tears threatening her composure. He gave her a final glance, half apology, half farewell, then left the room. Arabella sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers curled around the pin. The fire flickered in the hearth, throwing amber light across the walls, and for a long while she sat in silence, listening to the creak of the old house, to the breath of wind beyond the window. Then, drawn by something gentle and strange, she rose and crossed to the hearth. Kneeling, she brushed aside the old rug and discovered a small, loose stone. It lifted easily, revealing a shallow cavity. Inside was a leather-bound sketchbook worn at the edges. Its pages smelled of charcoal and lavender. Arabella opened it. Inside were drawings, soft, delicate renderings of garden blossoms, of the greenhouse, of the manor in sunlight. But the final pages held something else, the rough sketch of a child's hand, a sleeping face, a blanket. Over and over, the same child drawn in longing. A folded sheet of paper had been tucked behind the last page. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. "If ever you find this, Nathaniel, I want you to know I forgive you. You were not to blame. I saw how you held my hand even after the light left my eyes. I saw how you looked at our son briefly, only briefly, and how you wept when you thought no one saw. Live. That is all I ask. Don't bury your heart beside me. Let it beat again, for me, for you, Clara." Arabella pressed the letter to her chest. She cried then, not loudly, not in despair, but with the aching reverence one reserves for loss, finally given a voice. She slept that night in Clara's bed, not as a trespasser, but as a keeper of something sacred. And though she had never met the woman whose memory filled that room, she felt her presence like a whisper of roses in the air. Down the corridor, Nathaniel sat before the cold hearth of his own chamber, the fire unlit. His hand rested over his heart. The sapphire was gone from his cravat, but for the first time in years, he felt its weight had finally found a home. The evening air settled thick and breathless over Harcourt Manor, despite the frost that glittered over its roofs and terraces. A false stillness lay across the estate, like a mirror polished smooth to hide the storm brewing beneath. Inside, the warmth of firelight glowed in every hearth, casting shifting gold against the walls of ancient stone. The manor had never felt more alive, but neither Arabella nor Nathaniel knew the danger had already slipped past the gate. In the shadows of the servants' corridor, Ashton Wells, a former footman dismissed weeks earlier for insolence and drunken conduct, moved with furtive steps and the assurance of someone who knew the bones of the house. A bribe from Lord Pembroke had bought his bitterness, but the fire in his eyes needed no coin. It was the flame of wounded pride, of a man who believed the world owed him status and respect it never offered. He slipped into the east wing, unseen. Upstairs, Arabella stood before the portrait gallery, her fingertips brushing the edge of a canvas. Clara's likeness gazed back at her from the gilded frame, serene, radiant, with eyes that seemed carved from both sorrow and grace. She had come here not out of curiosity, but of need, to say goodbye, to close something in her heart that had no name. A sound echoed, a sharp crack, a scent bitter, acrid, smoke. At first it was faint, then came the heat. The corridor trembled with the first touch of flame. Arabella turned. A tongue of fire crawled beneath the skirting of the far wall, feeding on years of varnish, wax, and forgotten paper. The fire was not wild yet, but it moved fast, angry, hungry. She ran, but not away. She moved directly into the gallery, lifted Clara's portrait from the wall with trembling arms, and stumbled toward the staircase as heat licked at the edges of the rug. The smoke thickened. Her breath caught in her chest. Flames roared louder, devouring the drapes and curling up the banisters like vines of hell. She coughed. Her legs weakened, but she would not let go of the painting. Not this, not her. And then everything tilted. The world turned black. Downstairs, Nathaniel had been reviewing estate ledgers when the smell reached him, smoke sharp and unmistakable. The next moment, a servant burst into the study, eyes wide. "Your Grace, the East Wing." He was already moving before the sentence ended. Racing through the corridor, he called orders to the staff. Buckets, water lines, open the fire doors. Then he saw it, the bright, growing glow behind the far arch. And lying just beyond it, collapsed at the foot of the stairs, her skirts dark with soot, her arms still wrapped protectively around the gilded frame. "Arabella, God," he whispered, and ran to her through the smoke. He dropped to his knees, gathered her in his arms. Her face was pale beneath the soot, lips parted, breath shallow. "Arabella, Arabella, look at me." She stirred only faintly. He lifted her, portrait and all, cradling her as he had once cradled grief itself, and turned back towards safety. The staff parted to let him pass. In the foyer, he laid her gently on the chaise near the fire. "She needs air," Mrs. Ellison said, already bringing cloths and cold water. "She needs a doctor," he snapped, pulling off his coat and kneeling beside her again. Arabella coughed, her chest rising with painful effort. Then slowly her eyes opened, glazed at first, then sharpening as they focused on his face. "Nathaniel, you're safe," he whispered, pressing a damp cloth to her brow. "You're safe now. I didn't mean to be reckless," she murmured, "but I couldn't leave her there. Clara, she deserved more than flames." Tears burned in his eyes. He took her hand. "You saved her," he said hoarsely, "but it's you I nearly lost." She blinked up at him, something like disbelief in her gaze. "Why did you come for me?" He closed his fingers around hers. "Because I saw fire, and I knew what I could not bear to find inside it." Arabella's lips parted. Nathaniel leaned close, his forehead touching hers. "I love you," he breathed. "Not a memory, not a ghost. You." A tremble ran through her. Her hand gripped his. Her voice broke when she spoke. "Say it again." He drew back enough to meet her eyes. "I love you. You who walked into a house of sorrow and dared to wake it. You who saw the man beneath the morning. You who brought fire back into a heart that had turned to ash." A sob escaped her lips, not of sadness, but of release. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, softly this time, as if to soothe the earth after its fever. Inside, Clara's portrait leaned gently against the chaise, untouched by flame. And for the first time since her passing, it no longer held dominion over the room. It was part of the past, a past finally at peace. Arabella, still weak, let her eyes flutter closed again, but this time she smiled. Nathaniel stayed beside her, fingers entwined with hers, and in that firelit silence, the past let go, and the future quietly stepped in. London wore its winter like a mask of mourning, dignified, severe, and unyielding. Beneath layers of frost and propriety, the city buzzed with something colder than ice, speculation. The air in gentlemen's clubs and drawing rooms was thick with rumor, the kind dressed in silk and sharpened by envy. The name of the Duke of Rathbourne passed from mouth to mouth like a forbidden verse, once spoken with reverence, now with rising intrigue. He had danced with a governess in public, without apology. He had escorted her home. He had not withdrawn from society as expected. He had instead entered it again on his own terms, and society did not forgive such choices easily. Inside Whitehall Club, the fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth did not touch the tension gathering beneath the polished wood panels and crystal sconces. Lord Edwin Pembroke, resplendent in his double-breasted coat and crimson cravat, lounged in his usual chair, surrounded by men who feared him just enough to laugh at his jokes and nod at his provocations. He held court like a man certain of his position, secure in privilege, armed with influence. "I say," he mused, sipping brandy, "do we not think it dangerous when mourning turns to madness? Poor Harcourt parading around town with a creature plucked from the servant class. Makes one wonder if grief hasn't unstitched what little sense he had left." A few weak chuckles answered him, but they did not carry. Then the doors opened. Nathaniel Harcourt entered without flourish, but the silence that followed him was thunderous. He did not wear mourning today. His frock coat was deep blue, the waistcoat a muted grey. No mask, no cloak, only presence, unmistakable and unapologetic. He moved through the room with measured steps, as if each one carved away the distance between reputation and truth. Pembroke rose from his chair, posture relaxed, smile oily. "Your Grace," he said, bowing his head slightly. "How unexpected." Nathaniel met his gaze with a quiet that stripped the room of all pretense. Lord Pembroke. The others drew back instinctively, some murmuring excuses and slipping away like fog. "I see the city has been busy in my absence," Nathaniel said, voice low but carrying. "And you have been busier still." Pembroke's brow arched. "Society speaks for itself. I merely listen." "No," Nathaniel replied. "You manipulate. You poison." A flicker of something, wariness, passed behind Pembroke's eyes. Nathaniel stepped closer. "You bribed a dismissed servant to break into my home. My dear Duke, you tread dangerously close to accusation." "I no longer tread. I stand." A murmur passed through the remaining gentlemen. This was no longer a conversation. It was an unraveling. Nathaniel reached into his coat and drew forth a folded document. Affidavits from 3 servants, one from the apothecary who treated the man's burns, and a statement from the fire chief who found the accelerant placed with care in the east wing. "Shall I continue?" Pembroke stiffened. "I do not seek revenge," Nathaniel said, "but I will not allow your envy to endanger what remains of my household. Or her. You would defend a—" "Careful," Nathaniel warned, voice suddenly ice. Pembroke swallowed his words. Nathaniel turned to the gathered men. "I stand here not as a grieving widower, nor as the ghost of a title. I stand as a man who has buried enough silence to know its cost. I make no apology for loving again, and if my household receives whispers for it, so be it. Better a house alive with scandal than one sealed in death." He left the letter on the mantel, tipped his head slightly, and walked out. Behind him, reputations shifted, and Lord Pembroke's power crumbled. Hours later, the fire at Harcourt Manor burned gently in the drawing room. It was the same fire before which Arabella now stood, gloved hands clenched at her sides, a trunk beside her feet. The sky outside was streaked with rose and pearl, the color of morning trying to make peace with night. Her departure was not dramatic. It was quiet, like everything she had done. She had written her letter of thanks to Mrs. Ellison. She had folded the gown given to her by the Dowager Duchess. She had packed away the sapphire pin, not because she did not treasure it, but because she feared what it would mean to wear it when she no longer belonged here. She was not angry. She was resolved. Love, when it is not enough, must be released. She turned as the butler appeared. "The carriage is ready, miss." She nodded, lifting the hem of her cloak. Then, footsteps, she turned. Nathaniel was at the top of the staircase. No coat, no gloves. His breath short, his eyes shadowed with emotion too tightly held. "Arabella." She froze. He descended slowly, every step weighted with something deeper than words. "I thought you were in London." "I was." She gripped the handle of the trunk. He reached the base of the stairs. "You were leaving without a goodbye." "You've already said yours." "No," he said. "I gave you my silence. That is not the same." Her voice trembled. "What would you have me do? Stay in a house where I'm tolerated but not claimed, where your grief speaks louder than your heart?" My grief, he said, coming closer, has been buried by you. She shook her head. You don't know what you're asking. I know exactly what I'm asking. He dropped to one knee before her. Arabella gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. He reached into his coat and drew forth a small ring, modest in size but etched with his mother's crest. I cannot promise you a life free of judgment, he said, or a place in society that won't be questioned. But I can promise you this, a place in my heart, every day of my life, as my wife, as my equal. Not because you saved my home, or soothed my ghosts, or proved them wrong, but because you are the first truth I have dared to claim. Arabella stared at him, breathless. The wind picked up beyond the windows, but within the house all was still. She sank slowly to her knees beside him. Her forehead touched his, her tears fell freely, and her answer was only 2 words. Yes, Nathaniel. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and outside, the bells of the chapel down the hill rang as though they too had waited 11 years to be heard. The morning dawned, not with the usual hush of fog or the chill that clung to the moors, but with a strange golden insistence, as if the sun itself had waited long enough to return. For the first time in 11 years, the windows of Harcourt Manor were flung wide, and warm light spilled across stone floors that had once forgotten how to glow. There were footsteps in every corridor, voices, laughter, and in the air, that trembling sense of something sacred, fragile, and momentous. A wedding. The great hall, long untouched by celebration, had been transformed. No banners were hung, no grand orchestra played, for it was not pomp that defined this day. It was intimacy, dignity, and the quiet triumph of 2 hearts that had weathered every storm. The staff, once silent shadows in the background, now moved with smiles that softened even the sharpest lines of age. Mrs. Ellison, whose eyes had seen generations rise and fall within these walls, adjusted the final silver place setting with a hand that trembled, not from weakness, but from awe. She's changed the house, she whispered to no one in particular. She's brought it back. Upstairs, in the chamber once reserved for the daughter of dukes and the ghosts of memory, Arabella Dwyer stood before the mirror in a gown of ivory silk, simple and luminous. Her dark curls were swept away from her face, held by pearl pins, borrowed from the Dowager Duchess. At her throat rested the sapphire pin, once a relic of grief, now a gift freely given, glinting with new meaning. She had declined the services of a modiste. The dress was her own design, sewn with her own hands, a quiet rebellion against the pageantry expected of a duchess. I want to feel myself in it, she had said, not a stranger in another woman's fairy tale. Her reflection met her gaze. Not meek, not unsure, whole. Behind her, the Dowager Duchess entered with a bouquet of white heather and myrtle. For devotion, the old woman murmured, placing the flowers into Arabella's hands. And for courage. Arabella turned, emotion thick in her throat. Thank you. The Dowager offered a small smile. He was half alive when I first met him. But the moment he looked at you in that ballroom, child, I knew. You didn't bring him back to life. You reminded him he still had one. The clock struck 11. The manor doors opened, and the world came in. Guests arrived not in throngs, but in meaningful numbers. True allies, not mere social vultures. Among them were former pupils of Arabella's, a few distant cousins of Nathaniel's, the local vicar, and Lady Genevieve Ellsworth, who had once scorned Arabella with icy disdain, but now nodded at her with a reluctant glint of admiration. The drawing room had been converted into a chapel, its hearth roaring with the warmth of late winter. The portrait of Clara Harcourt, freshly cleaned and reframed, hung above the mantel, not hidden, not replaced, but honored. Nathaniel stood before the fire, his dark suit cut with elegant simplicity. He wore no cravat pin, no family jewels, only a plain silver band on his smallest finger, a token from his father. His hands were folded behind his back. His jaw was tight. But when he saw Arabella enter, every line of his body softened. She walked slowly, her steps steady, as all turned to witness the impossible. A governess who had once been cast out in shame, now crossing the threshold of nobility, not by wealth, but by love earned, tested and proven. The ceremony was brief but not cold. Every vow spoken felt like it echoed against the walls, carving new life into stone that had long forgotten joy. When the vicar asked, "Do you take this man?" Arabella's voice did not waver. "I do." When Nathaniel replied, "And do you take this woman?" His voice carried the weight of every year he had mourned and every second he had waited to begin again. "I do." They did not kiss like lovers in a novel. They kissed like souls recognizing one another at last, a kiss of relief, of homecoming. And the house, this solemn, brooding place, breathed. Music filled the corridors, not with fanfare, but with melody. Violin, cello, and soft piano, dancing through the arches like spring thawing the frost. Arabella walked through the rooms like someone newly born to them, her hand resting lightly on Nathaniel's arm. Guests spoke to her with the hesitancy of those unsure how to address a woman who had rewritten every rule they knew. She answered each one not with arrogance, but with clarity. Her words were chosen, her voice calm. She had once been invisible. Now she was seen. In the early afternoon, when the guests wandered out to the gardens for warm cider and plum cakes, Arabella remained inside for a moment, alone. She wandered into the East Gallery, the wing that had once burned, now restored. There, among portraits of long-dead dukes and duchesses, Clara's portrait stood renewed. Arabella looked up at it, the painted eyes serene. "I will not erase you," she whispered. "You were his beginning, but I will be his future." She placed a single white rose beneath the frame. Behind her, Nathaniel's voice broke the silence. "She would have liked you." Arabella turned. "She would have liked that you speak plainly," he continued, "and that you do not try to replace her. I could never. No, and you shouldn't. You are not here to erase her. You are here to remind me that I can hold grief and hope in the same breath." Arabella stepped to him, their hands finding each other without effort. Outside, the manor bells rang again. Laughter rose from the gardens, and for the first time in over a decade, Harcourt Manor was filled not with echoes of sorrow, but with life. As evening fell, Arabella stood at the threshold of her new home, the last rays of sun catching in her sapphire pin. Nathaniel came beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. "What do you see?" he asked softly. She looked out over the fields, the bare trees dusted in gold. "A house," she said, "with light again." And he, watching her instead of the view, whispered, "So do I." Autumn had returned to Harcourt Manor, not with the heaviness of farewell, but with the hush of gratitude. The leaves outside the drawing-room window burned with amber and crimson, falling gently upon the stone paths, where small boots now left chaotic prints and laughter echoed in all directions. Inside, a soft golden fire crackled in the hearth, and the scent of baked apples and lavender drifted through the corridors. Arabella Harcourt, now Duchess of Rathbourne, sat near the window in a deep armchair, her lap full of mending, though her needle remained still. She was watching the garden, or rather, the scene within it. A boy of 7 with dark curls and bright eyes chased a cocker spaniel through the last remnants of fallen leaves, shouting with the boundless energy of one who believed the world was entirely his to love. Behind him toddled a girl of 4, determined to keep pace, her flaxen hair tied in a ribbon far too fine for mud and moss, yet proudly worn all the same. Nathaniel stood under the arbor, holding a letter in his hand, half read, forgotten. His gaze was not on the parchment, it was on his wife. The way she smiled when the children fell in a heap of giggles, the way her eyes, still lit from within, searched the garden as though she were still discovering new corners of it. And she was. She always was. He crossed the lawn slowly, as if afraid to disturb the moment. "You've not stitched a thing," he said gently, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I've stitched 1,000 memories," she replied with a smile, resting her hand on his. That's far better. The years had not dimmed them, they had deepened them. His hair was more silver now, especially at the temples, and hers had taken on new honeyed tones, but their glances had not lost their quiet fire. Their love had not faded. It had settled into the walls of the manor, the laughter of their children, the long walks, the silences filled with shared glances. It had bloomed not in grand declarations, but in the everyday, in the books read aloud, in the hands held through illnesses, in the stormy nights spent watching the fire together. They had named their son Edward Nathaniel, not after his father or hers, but for the promise of a new line written on their own terms. Their daughter was called Clara Arabella, a name chosen without hesitation, born not of grief, but of peace. The portrait of Clara Harcourt still hung in the East Gallery, surrounded now by new paintings. One of Arabella with the children, one of Nathaniel seated in his study, drawn by Arabella's hand in soft charcoal. Mrs. Ellison, ever dignified, now walked with a cane and slower steps, but her voice remained as sharp as ever. She no longer spoke of ghosts, only of the miracle of a house that had remembered how to live. And as for Lord Pembroke, his exile from society had become permanent. A scandal too deep, too cowardly, and too destructive had cost him his reputation and wealth. He had fled to Italy, they said, taking with him only what he could carry. No one spoke of him now, except in warnings whispered at evening parties. The world had changed. The whispers that once followed Arabella's rise had softened, then vanished altogether. Others began to follow, duchesses who wrote, heiresses who taught, daughters of clerks who dared to marry not for duty, but for affection. She had not set out to change the world. She had simply loved with honor, and that had been enough. At twilight, the family gathered in the music room. Nathaniel played the piano now, rarely, only when the children begged. He sat at the bench, their son beside him, trying to match the chords. Clara Arabella curled in Arabella's lap, humming tunelessly and kissing her mother's wrist. "I heard a story today," Arabella whispered into her daughter's hair, "of a lonely house long ago that was rescued by a little spark. A woman with nothing, no fortune, no name, stepped through the door during a storm." "What happened to her?" Clara asked sleepily. "She stayed," Arabella replied, her voice thick with wonder. "And the house became something more, a home." The child nodded, already drifting into dreams. Outside, the wind swept gently through the trees, carrying with it the laughter of two children, the notes of a piano, and the heartbeat of a love that had not only survived the years, it had written its own legacy. And within Harcourt Manor, the lights stayed on. Always. In every life, there comes a storm, unexpected, uninvited, and often merciless. But sometimes, that very storm carries us to where we were always meant to be. Arabella and Nathaniel's story is not just about love that defies scandal, or hearts that find one another across the divide of class, silence, and sorrow. It is a testament to something deeper, that healing is possible, that second chances are real, and that no one is too lost, too forgotten, or too broken to be loved again. In a world that still clings to appearances, Arabella found the courage to speak her truth, and in doing so, changed not only her fate, but the soul of a man who had long stopped believing in joy. Nathaniel, once imprisoned by the past, chose life over mourning, love over fear. And together they built a home not on perfection, but on tenderness and truth. If this story moved you, we would love to hear from you. Leave us a comment below sharing what touched your heart most. And if you made it all the way to the end, write the word sapphire in the comments. That way, we'll know you stayed until the very last flicker of candlelight in Harcourt Manor, and that you're one of us, a true romantic soul. If this tale left a mark on your heart and you'd like to help us keep telling more stories like this one, we invite you, gently and gratefully, to consider sending a super thanks here on YouTube with any amount that feels right to you. It helps support our little team and brings more period romances to life for everyone. And if you're not able to support financially right now, that's perfectly fine. Sharing this story with a friend, a sister, or someone who still believes in timeless love is another beautiful way to help. Before you go, don't miss the other passionate and emotional romances we've added in the cards above. There's more waiting for you, more stories, more hope, more hearts finding their way home. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing in love that lasts.